Hello everyone and welcome, Nerdstorm here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you my Magicka Dragonknight PvP build for the Flames of Ambition patch. This build has been super enjoyable to play in Cyrodiil for the last couple of weeks. It's got a ton of damage and sustain, survives really well, and has a lot more mobility than any build I've played in quite a while. I've been looking forward to sharing this build with you all, so here it is at last. Before we get started with this build, I'd like to make 3 quick notes. First, this build is meant to be played in Cyrodiil Open World. For the next 3 to 6 months, there's a limited pool of sets you can use in Cyrodiil, as proc sets are disabled. In this meta, this build is the optimal MagDK build and the most fun build to use. However, in different PvP environments where procs are allowed to be used, such as Battlegrounds, this build might not be as optimal. In addition, I also wanted to mention that this build will finally have a written version in my own website, nerdstorm.com. In case you guys missed the official announcement, I now have my own website full of builds and guides that are fully dedicated to ESO PvP that you can go and check out. This build is already featured on it with all the information you'll find in this video and some additional explanations, so I encourage you guys to go and check it out. In addition, I've teamed up with a bunch of other amazing players and content creators whose builds I feature on my site to give their content a platform and make sure my site has nothing but the highest quality builds from the top PvP content creators of this game. There's a ton of content waiting for you there, so definitely go and give it a check. Lastly, I wanted to give a big shout out to my patrons on Patreon. Thank you so much for all your support through this time. Thanks to you, I'm able to keep creating more content for you and everyone else. If you guys enjoy my content and have been watching my build videos and guides over the years, or even if you're new viewers here and like what you see, please consider checking out my Patreon page. It's the best way to support me and what I do, and you can get some awesome benefits in return. I'll really appreciate it. Now, without further ado, let's get started with this build. Starting up with our attributes, as you can see, I got a few points into health just to round up our HP pool to make sure we get it over the 30k, and the rest of the attributes obviously go to our Magicka. As for our stats, as you can see, we have 40k max Magicka, 30k max health, and 19k max stam, so really good max stats all around. Our Magicka recovery, while we have our potion buff up, is going to be at over 2k, so our sustain feels great, and we have 700 stamina regen, which is a nice little extra. As for our spell damage, if we buff up with both our potion and a couple casts of Engulfing Flames here for the Ardent Flame abilities for the Seething Fury buff, you can see our spell damage is at around 4k, but that's not even fully buffed. If we use our back bar enchant on top of it, it can go almost all the way up to the 4.5k mark when we are fully buffed. Our spell critical is at 30% with our potion buff up again, and our spell penetration is at 4.2k, but with the addition of Major Breach from our Elemental Drain, it'll actually get to about 10k penetration in reality, so our offensive stats are really good and will allow us to burst down even tankier players in CP Cyrodiil. As for our resists, if we just buff up real quick, you can see we have 29k spell, 21k physical resistance with 3k crit resist on top, which will help us survive enemy gankers, zergs, or anything in between. In addition to the tons of damage mitigation that we have on this build, which I will go over very shortly. As for our sets, the main 2 sets we are using on this build are Impregnable Armor and Crafty Alfiq. Impreg is a really strong defensive set, as it allows us to not use Impen as a trait and not use the crit resist CP star while still retaining a high crit resistance. This allows us to use a lot of divine species, which increase our mag recovery thanks to the Atronach Mundus stone. Alfiq is a really strong set as well, as it gives us a ton of max Magicka, which increases our damage and our heals. While sets like Spinners could potentially be better for the offense, they do not affect our healing power. As a result, Crafty Alfiq is still the best offensive set we can use on our build if we consider healing done as well. Lastly, we are also using 2 different one-piece monster helms of Swarm Mother and Dummy House, both of them having the same one-piece effect, just to increase our max Magicka and stamina. It's important to mention here that the main reason we use Divines as a main trait this patch is that the armor changes and penalties make cost reductions such as the Sturdy trait highly ineffective if you use multiple pieces of light armor, which we still want to use to increase our damage. Due to this ineffectiveness of Sturdy, the clunkiness of well-fitted on melee builds, and the nerf to the Impen trait, Divines is the highest value body trait we can use this patch on a MagDK with multiple light armor pieces. As for our armor weights, we are using 3 light for damage, 3 heavy to offset the light armor penalties, and 1 medium for the undaunted passives. For our jewelry traits, we are currently using 2 pieces of Swift to increase our mobility to kite enemy Zergs, and 1 infused for more damage. Our weapon traits are optimized to deal the most damage and keep a lot of healing power on both bars. I'll now go over all of my pieces so you can see exactly what I am using. Next to our skills, starting with the front bar, we are using Burning Embers, as it's a very important damage over time or dot ability that also heals us for massive values upon recast. It's super important to apply this dot to as many enemy players as you can when you're 1vxing, so you can get a lot of heal value back. Next, we are using Molten Whip. This skill is not to be used as a spammable like the other morph of it, but instead as your main burst damage skill. You want to apply other Ardent Flame abilities and dots to enemy players first, and then cast this skill for a massive burst when it's fully buffed by the Seething Fury procs. The next skill I'm using is Engulfing Flames. It's yet another super important dot and debuff you want to apply to enemies. We also use it as our AoE spammable for the majority of the fight, as it helps us build up our Molten Whips for the big damage. Fossilize is our super strong CC ability, which locks down our enemies so we can deal our burst damage to them through either leap or whip. Next, Elemental Drain, a really useful skill that reduces enemies' armor rates similarly to increasing our own penetration against them, as well as sustains some additional magicka for us. You want to try and apply this skill to enemies as often as possible throughout a fight. Lastly, on the front bar, Ferocious Leap. This is a really strong ultimate that we use for a massive burst of damage. We try to time it right before our Molten Whip, meaning we first debuff our enemies with Elemental Drain and Engulfing. We then cast several more Ardent Flame abilities between Engulfing Flames and Burning Embers. Then we lock our enemies down with Fossilize. We then finally leap them, and right after cast our Whip to try and burn them and burst them down all the way to no health. On the back bar, we are using Meditate or Deep Thoughts as our flex spot. You can change it up as you like, whatever skills you prefer to use here, but I personally find this skill super useful for outnumbered fights, as I tend to kite behind walls or rocks and meditate until the Zerg catches up to me, then attack them with my resources being full, both my magicka and my stamina, thanks to the huge sustained value of this skill. Next, we are using Cauterize, which gives us a strong heal every 5 seconds that will help us survive whether we're on the offense or the defense throughout the fight. Coagulating Blood is our main heal and our oh shit button that we cast for a massive surge of health whenever we take a ton of pressure. We try to not cast it too often as it costs a ton of magicka, but it helps us survive in extreme scenarios, so it's important to learn to use it correctly. Next, we are using Mist Form, or Elusive Mist. Yes, this means we are using a vampire on this build for once. I tend to not like using Vamprism on my MagDKs normally, but in this meta, I feel like Elusive Mist is so important that I decided to become a vampire especially for it. While normally Race Against Time from the Psychic skill line is more than enough of a mobility skill for us, this patch has a really swingy meta where people can burst you down super quickly, especially if you play outnumbered, which is why it's so important to gain the mitigation of Mist Form alongside its mobility bonuses, to be able to kite the Zerg and survive the damage you take from it until you're ready to turn back and kill them all. We even got some bonuses in our CP, which I'll get to later, that synergize with Mist Form very effectively. Volatile Armor is our next skill. We use it to gain our major resolve buff for the most part, but it also helps us deal a bit more damage around us and reveal gankers nearby, and so on and so forth. Lastly, we are using Swarming Cyan, the Vampire Ultimate. We don't use this skill all too often, but occasionally it can be really important to use it when we have a huge Zerg fighting us and you feel like you need a lot of healing power to survive when you go on the offense, beyond what you'll be getting when you cast Leap, for example. It's a fantastic ultimate to use to stay alive in the middle of an enemy group despite taking a whole lot of damage, and it also deals a great AoE dot to all enemy players that it reaches. Next to our champion points, starting with the Warfare tree. The first thing you want to unlock on this tree is your increased Magicka and Stamina stats. After you unlock these two, you want to focus on your slottable stars before you go to the rest of the passives. We have 4 different slottable stars we are using on this build, of course, which are 2 offensive and 2 defensive ones, which you can prioritize as you wish. The 2 offensive stars we use are Deadly Aim and Biting Aura, and the 2 defensive ones are going to be Unassailable and Duelist's Rebuff. For the offensive slottable stars, it is common to think that DKs would like to use Thaumaturge as it affects our damage over time abilities. But the value of Thaumaturge through the new remade CP system is so very low that even if you have 3 different dots on an enemy player and the Vampire Ultimate going at the same time, the value of Thaumaturge is still not going to reach over 1k damage per second, and so it is more relevant for you to use a Deadly Aim and Biting Aura and keep Thaumaturge off of your slottable bar. For the defense, we are using Unassailable and Duelist's Rebuff, as these are the most 2 common damage types you will be receiving as damage against you, and so it's really good to mitigate both of those. After you unlock your slottable stars, you want to focus on unlocking your Blessed for extra healing and Precision for extra critical chance, and then you can choose to focus on either your offense through the extended might tree or your defense through the starving death tree. For the red fitness tree, we have several different options we want to touch on here. First of all, the first thing you want to unlock is the Hero's Vigor passive to increase your max health. Afterwards, again, you want to focus on your slottable stars before you go to the passive stars. For the slottable stars here, we use first of all Juggernaut. This is the most important one. It gives you extra damage mitigation whenever you are affected by crowd control immunity. This applies to after you break free from an enemy stun, but also applies to when you are in mist form. When you are in mist form, you are technically immune to crowd control abilities, and yes, you gain the extra mitigation from Juggernaut in that time, on top of mist form's own damage reduction, which makes this synergy really powerful, as you'll be taking very little damage while in mist form. The next slottable star we are using is Survival Instinct, as it increases your cost of your roll dodges, blocks, and break freeze, etc. throughout a fight whenever you have a status effect applied to you, which is almost always when you fight outnumbered. We are also using Rejuvenation for increased Magicka and Stamina recovery. The health recovery is not super important, but is a nice touch on top as well. And last, we are using Ironclad to increase our armor value. Another option that I really like using on this build, sometimes instead of Ironclad, is Slippery. While normally I would think, and most people would think, that Slippery is not particularly relevant because it just does an action for you, it breaks free for you, and you can do that normally on your own without help from the CP system, it actually is really good for your stamina sustain, as it doesn't cost you at all for this break free. In addition, it sometimes is really nice to have when the game is very laggy and your break free isn't working. Slippery can sometimes save you from some sticky situations. After you unlock your slottable stars, you want to first of all focus on the blocking passives, which are the whole right wing over here. Then you want to focus on breaking free, on roll dodging cost, and then you can go for all the rest of the passives such as movement, speed, sprinting, etc. For the green craft tree, this tree is not directly affecting combat very much, and so it isn't super important to unlock anything in here. However, my personal preferences are to first of all unlock Breakfall to reduce my damage taken when I kite off of a tower or a keep wall, when I jump down from a cliff and a bunch of enemies are chasing me. They will be taking more damage than I will, and that can help me win that fight. And for my slottable stars, I am using Steed's Blessing for extra movement speed between fights. I'm using Rationale Nightmare and Liquid Efficiency to spend less gold on my PvP addiction, and I am using War Mount to help me worry less about getting ganked off of my mount while I'm running in Cyrodiil. Next, some more general pieces of information. The Mundus we are using on this build is the Atrenak, as with the Divine trait we are using, we get about 500 Magicka recovery from it, which helps us sustain really well despite the fact DK skills are really expensive. The food we are using on this build is the Artium Pickled Fish Bowl. We use this food since our max stam pool is already really high, so we don't need extra for it, and this food is the best food that gives us the most max health and max magicka in the whole game at the moment. So if you like to, you can replace it with Bewitched. You'll have a little bit less health and magicka and a little bit more stam and health regen, and it's not a bad trade-off, but for me personally, I prefer the Pickled Fish Bowl because it increases my health and magicka more than any other food at the moment. For the potion we use on this build, we are using mainly the spell power potions, as we need them since we have no source of major sorcery or major prophecy on the front bar, and this potion helps us increase our damage and healing power, both thanks to those buffs. When we take a ton of pressure from enemies and need more stam or health, we can occasionally use tri-stat potions, whether crowns or normal, it's the same value, but for the most part we definitely want to stick to the spell power potions, as it gives us really important buffs that we don't have otherwise. As for our Vamprism, we try to stick to stage 1 Vampire. The main reason for that is that our abilities are already super expensive on MagDKs, so we really don't want any more cost increases to them beyond the must-have of stage 1. In addition, the Undeaf passive is not currently working properly. It is a little bit bugged, and so we wouldn't benefit from higher Vampire stages much anyways. As for our race on this build, we tend to choose Breton. I like Breton the most on this build as it reduces the cost of our Magicka abilities. You could also play this build as a High Elf, Dark Elf, or Argonian, and that'll be perfectly fine, and all other races are okay as well, although unoptimized, but in my personal opinion, Breton is the best one thanks to the Magicka cost reduction, our extra resistances, Magicka recovery, and max Magicka passives. I feel like it's the best kit that we need on this build to sustain really well and have the best success. And that's about it. Thank you all for watching this build video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful, and that you'll enjoy playing this build in Cyrodiil. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit like and subscribe for more of my content. I'll also be linking my Discord and Twitter in the description, where you can contact me if you have any questions or wonders about this build, as well as my Twitch channel where I play this build and others live 5 times every week, and the written version of this build on my own website as well, so do check those out in the description. I'll now leave you with some gameplay of this build in action. I'll hope you'll enjoy. Until next time.